Good afternoon. I'm Amy Turney, and I am the Gun Safety Issue Chair for the League of Women Voters of Texas. I've been the Gun Safety Issue Chair since 2017, the last year that I was president of the League of Women Voters of the Houston area. I'd like to introduce Grace Shemaine. She is president of the League of Women Voters of Texas. Ms. Shemaine is a retired nurse practitioner, and she has also served as the advocacy chair and gun safety issue chair since she joined the board of directors of the league in 2014.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. The first three words of the Second Amendment are a well-regulated, yet shall not be infringed. The last four words of that amendment seem to supersede the first three words in the minds of many. We hope that the newly created committee, the Senate on Constitutional Issues Special, which was created last week, will consider this when hearing HB 1927 this Thursday morning. One must be registered and present identification to vote in Texas. Yet permitless carry bills will remove the requirement for most handgun owners to have a license. No background check, training, or demonstration of proficiency will be required to carry a handgun in public. The LWV US position on gun safety is to support violence prevention programs in communities and protect the health and safety of citizens through limiting the accessibility and regulating the ownership of handguns and semi-automatic weapons, and to support regulation of firearms for consumer safety. If you agree that the first three words of the Second Amendment are as important as the last four, please contact your senator, the lieutenant governor, and the governor about this permitless carry bill and any others that may get traction in the Texas legislature. The League of Women Voters of Texas has an action alert on their website at lwvtexas.org, and we'll put that in the chat, that will send an email to your legislators. It's really easy to use. You may also testify during the Senate committee hearing, the Senate Committee on Constitutional Issues this Thursday at the Capitol in room E1016. The hearing begins at 9 a.m. and you will be allowed to testify for 2 minutes. For those who wish to testify and be on the public record, please bring 20 copies of your testimony to give to the committee clerk. The Senate committee hearings require that attendees wear a mask when they're in a committee room, and that you display a wristband indicating that one has taken the COVID test or that you've already had the vaccinations. Today, we will hear from a panel of community leaders who are in agreement with the League that the first three words of the Second Amendment are as important as the last four. We will answer questions at the end of the press conference. Amy Mobley Turney will monitor the Q&A for questions, so you can put those questions in anytime. And the media may also use the raised hand function at the end of the press conference and to be acknowledged, and your video will come on. So thank you. First panelist up will be Jill Switzer, who has been the executive director of Texas Gun Sense since August 2017. Prior to Texas Gun Sense, Jill was a mental health policy advocate for about 10 years. Jill also worked in other federal, state, and local government professional positions. She has a master's degree in public affairs and in public health. Jill?
Thank you so much, Grace, and thanks to the League of Women Voters for organizing this press conference. I am glad to be first because then I'll relax and listen to the other smart people behind me. I want to say Texas Gun Sense is a nonpartisan nonprofit, and we advocate for smart gun-related policies to stop gun tragedies. We're not anti-gun, we're pro-safety. That's the way I say it. This bill has to be the least safe bill I've seen in a very long time, maybe ever. Current law in Texas is to carry a handgun in public. A person has to have a license to carry. And that means you have to get a background check. You have to have classroom or virtual training about safety and gun laws. And you have to demonstrate a level of live fire shooting proficiency in front of a licensed to carry instructors. Common sense policies that make sense for Texas. The permitless carry bills that are being considered now, House Bill 1927 passed the Texas House of Representatives. Last week, a bill was filed in the Senate, Senate Bill 2224, and the Special Committee on Constitutional Issues was formulated. Very concerning that guns are coming up late and committees being created late. I have been at the legislature working for a long time, and that's not the usual process. The permitless carry bills, the two I've mentioned and others that have been filed, call for essentially no license to carry. A person can carry a handgun in public if they're over 21 years of age and they are not otherwise prohibited by state or federal law from carrying a gun. But who's going to check? Who's going to know? Because the permitless carry bills call for no background check, no training, no demonstration of proficiency. These are a problem. Some data, because Texas Gun Sense is often obsessed with data. In 2020, license to carry for 2,422 license applications were denied. 3,412 licenses were suspended and 573 licenses were revoked. Do we want these people armed on our streets with a handgun? I also want to say that a recent poll, March 2021, from the Dallas Morning News and UT Tyler, said that 64% of Texans, including 56% of gun owners, do not want to change our license to carry. The most important statistic, and that scares me the most, is that states have weakened their permitting process, have seen a double-digit increase in handgun homicide rates and violent crime. I join Grace in inviting folks to register and attend the hearing on Thursday of the Senate Special Committee, and to contact your legislators and the Lieutenant Governor and say you oppose permitless carry. One last comment I wanted to make is that constitutional carry is what some folks call these proposed bills. Nothing constitutional about them. As Grace has mentioned, the Second Amendment needs to be read in its entirety, and even conservative lawmakers, policymakers like Justice Scalia in the Supreme Court said Second Amendment is not unlimited. Every right has responsibilities. For example, as I told a panel the other day at the legislature, it's probably an infringement on my First Amendment rights to only get 2 minutes to testify. So let's be responsible in Texas and say no to permitless carry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jill. I appreciate your comments. Next up is Emily Dawn Whitehurst, who is the president and CEO of the Houston Area Women's Center, a 41-year-old organization dedicated to ending domestic and sexual violence for all. In her role, Ms. Whitehurst engages the greater Houston community in efforts to support survivors and their families in a trauma-informed, culturally competent way. She holds a Master of Divinity and is an ordained Presbyterian minister. For the sake of her community, and especially her 2 daughters, she believes in a future free from domestic abuse and sexual assault, and will work until it stops. Emily?
Thank you. Thank you for having me for today and for elevating the concerns of survivors as it relates to this piece of legislation. As many of you know, domestic, family, and intimate partner violence have spiked in the wake of COVID. Just to give you a snapshot of the hell survivors are enduring in the Houston area, we saw a 60% spike in domestic violence-related homicides year to year during the pandemic period, the height. Sheriff Gonzalez is here, and I know he'll speak more specifically, but according to statistics we've seen from his department, there's been a 50% increase in violence in a 4-month period, Protective orders in Houston have tripled during the height of the stay-at-home orders during the pandemic. And at our agency, on some days, calls to our hotline spiked by as much as 50%. In addition to that, the calls that were coming through were horrifying, levels of violence that was unprecedented. So what I want to know is why? Why is the legislature contemplating permitless carry at a time like this? Why now? We have bigger problems in our communities, as you just heard. I also want to add our grave concerns as an agency responsible for sheltering survivors at multiple sites throughout the city. Our shelter and in hotels, the thought that a perpetrator could have the luxury of carrying a firearm without a safety course and the background check that goes with it, it's chilling. I can tell you, we've had a few instances of abusers showing up at our hotels and at our shelter. And this past year, we tripled the number of women and children fleeing violence who stayed in our Safe Harbor Hotel program. So again, I want to know, why now? Violence is escalating, women and children are dying, our frontline advocates are exhausted and alarmed. There is absolutely nothing to be gained from reducing safeguards. And do not tell me that this approach is going to keep people safer. Especially, don't tell me this kind of legislation is for the sake of safety of survivors. Just last Friday, a 16-year-old teenage girl was shot in the face and died. Her 20-year-old boyfriend was charged with murder. Preventing such a tragedy should be the focus of the legislature. We need our attention and resources focused on teaching our young adults about healthy relationships, not carelessly allowing them to arm themselves without a permit so they can shoot their partners. Let me be clear. Under House Bill 1927, we expect more women to die. Full stop. Abusers will slip through the cracks. Absent training and background check, they will do damage. We cannot and will not let this happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very moving. Matthew Lovett is up next. He is a person in long-term recovery from mental health and substance use disorders. He holds certification as a recovery support peer specialist and is pursuing a Master of Social Work from the University of Houston. He has supported individuals in recovery in inpatient, outpatient, and community settings. NAMI Texas is a nonprofit 501c3 organization with 27 local NAMI affiliate organizations. Their mission is to help improve the quality of life for individuals living with mental illness as well as the lives of their families. Matthew?
Thank you, Grace. Again, my name is Matthew Lovett. I serve as the Peer Policy Fellow with the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, Texas. With respect to permitless carry, we are primarily concerned about the associated increase in access to lethal means and what it may mean for individuals experiencing a mental health crisis. Since 2000, the suicide rate in Texas has risen 36%. One person dies by suicide every 2 hours. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for people aged 15 to 34. Youth are particularly vulnerable during periods of heightened stress and distress, such as many experienced during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Research indicates that rates of depression and anxiety have increased over the past year, as well as increases in reported rates of irritability, loneliness, nervousness, uneasiness, and worry. Parental stress has also been found to increase stress in children. If there are fewer restrictions on gun ownership, people may be more inclined to purchase a weapon. More guns in more hands may mean that youth with mental health concerns may have better access. It is also possible that people who purchase guns due to loosening restrictions may not have the knowledge, have knowledge about safe storage, which again, may make them easier to access for youth. A sobering statistic, the time between a suicidal ideation and an attempt can be as little as 10 minutes. These concerns played out in Missouri, which has been loosening gun laws since 2000. In 2017, they enacted a permitless carry bill, and rates of suicide subsequently increased. On the other end of the spectrum, suicide rates are consistently the lowest in states that have enacted or maintained common sense gun laws. There isn't a one-to-one correlation between permitless carry and suicide, of course, but they trend in the same direction, which is concerning. So NAMI Texas believes that in order to ensure that youth or adolescents with mental health concerns are as safe as possible and they're able to access the care that they need, we should, as Texas should, limit access to guns or lethal means as best as possible. And that means, unfortunately, opposing HB 1927.
Thank you. Up next is Sheriff Ed Gonzalez. After retiring from 18 years of service with the Houston Police Department in 2009, where he served as the elite hostage negotiation team, on the elite hostage negotiation team, and was assigned to the Homicide Division as an investigator, Sheriff Ed Gonzalez served 3 terms on the Houston City Council. He was elected by his peers in 2010 to serve as Vice Mayor Pro Tem and was appointed Mayor Pro Tem in 2012 by Mayor Anise Parker. Sheriff Gonzalez chaired the council's Public Safety and Homeland Security Committee. The Harris County Sheriff's Office is the largest sheriff's office in the state of Texas and the 3rd largest nationwide. Sheriff Gonzalez leads upwards of 5,000 employees to protect the county's 4.5 million residents within Harris County. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Police chiefs and sheriffs across Texas have spoken clearly on this issue. Permitless carry does not make our community safer. Instead, it increases the odds of deadly confrontations and puts the lives of first responders at even greater risk. Texas's current concealed handgun license process ensures that citizens carrying guns in public have complete background checks and have been properly trained on gun safety. Permitless carry seems to me simply a return to the Wild West vigilante justice. We can do better than that. In many ways, to me, this is almost a distraction of dealing with some other critical issues that are at stake. I wish we would be spending time talking about critical red flag gun laws, which I totally support. We should be talking about making sure that people maintain their right to vote. These are all critical issues that we should be talking about. Is it that difficult to require a permit, a basic permit to carry a deadly weapon? It seems irresponsible that we would eliminate just basic common sense regulations. The current system serves as an important safeguard. It educates gun owners about the correct and law-abiding instances where the use of a firearm is appropriate. And it also provides just important basic information on proficiency, similar to what we require when somebody's going to start driving, that we require them to have some basic understanding of traffic laws and just basic understanding of how to use a vehicle properly. Again, these are all basic things that provide important safeguards. And I think right now, we need to be finding ways to reduce gun violence. Emily Dawn Whitehurst, the president and CEO of Houston Area Women's Center, spoke about a tragic case involving a teen, a 16-year-old, that is suspected of dying as in regards to a shooting at the hands of her boyfriend. The Harris County Sheriff's Office responded to that. We're investigating that. We see this every day. Just yesterday, I myself responded to a scene where several individuals are suspected at firing numerous rounds at an individual, killing one adult male and seriously injuring a 3.5-year-old little girl that's currently fighting for her life, possibly because a stray bullet struck her. Again, no proficiency. Irresponsible. We should be finding ways to reduce gun violence, not be using permitless carry as a distraction. This nonsense needs to stop. We need our lawmakers to focus on legislation that will make us safer, rather than legislation that will just appeal to the special interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Cedric Dark is founder and executive editor of Policy Prescriptions. Currently, Dr. Dark is an assistant professor in Henry J.N. Taub Department of Emergency at Baylor College of Medicine. Dr. Dark is the 2017 recipient of the Texas Medical Association's Frank Weber Award and the 2019 American College of Emergency Medicine Physicians Choosing Wisely Champion. He currently participates on the editorial advisory board for the monthly publication of the American College of Emergency Physicians, and now is on the board of directors for Doctors for America. Dr. Dark.
Thank you very much, Grace, for having me. I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the science behind what permitless carry might mean in Texas. But I'll start out with a little bit of a story of the last patient that I took care of that was involved with gun violence. It was actually a fairly busy day a few weeks ago when I was working last. We had a lot of people that were shot, but one guy that came in was shot. There were 2 holes, one in the back of his head, one like right around here, coming out the front of his head. And as we sat there, the gentleman was completely unconscious, not able to protect his airway. It was our job as physicians to put a breathing tube in him. Blood was spurting out of his forehead towards us while we were trying to save this man's life. And ultimately, probably within about 24 hours, he succumbed to his injuries. You know, that's one of the reasons why physicians like myself like to speak up about these issues, is because we deal with this every day. And unlike the NRA that claims that we don't have a right to speak on this, I would say we do, because not only do I see this every day in my line of work, I also have studied policymaking. I've worked on Capitol Hill. I know how that also takes place. And I've studied the science of it. So for instance, I don't know if any of you read the RAND report, Science of Gun Policy. It's a fascinating read. I'm being completely sarcastic about that. It's 377 pages. It's really long and dry and boring, but it's full of all the best science that we have available. And the best science that we have says that concealed carry laws may increase violent crime, maybe up to about 15%. Now, Texas has a shall issue law. There's also what we call may issue laws, where law enforcement gets the opportunity to say, well, this person wants to apply for a concealed carry license. Well, is there something fishy about them where they shouldn't actually be allowed to walk around in public? What the bill that is currently under debate in the Texas Senate would actually do the opposite direction, which is say, we don't even need to have you try to apply for a permit. You can just go out without a permit whatsoever. And from my standpoint, we're talking about something that is inherently a dangerous product, something that's only intention is to kill or to maim. And really, do we want to go out and make that more accessible to people when we know that the science shows that it will increase violent crime? So that's my appeal to people that listen to what the doctor has to say. What they want to do with it is just like what would happen if I saw you and you had high blood pressure or diabetes, and I would say, take these pills or do this exercise regimen. It's up to you, and it's up to our legislators to decide what they want to do about it. But hopefully they'll take the doctor's advice as opposed to following their own.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts. Next up is Jan Edgar Langbein, who for 30 years has been an activist in efforts to end violence against women. Currently, as CEO of Genesis Women's Shelter and Support, Ms. Langbein oversees Genesis internal and an external operation, as well as funding and community education. She has been recognized as a national expert on the dynamics and effects of domestic violence. She provides expert testimony in court cases, trains law enforcement and prosecutorial professionals to enhance their efforts to end violence against women. In partnership with the Dallas Police Department and the FBI, Ms. Langbein co-founded the annual International Conference on Crimes Against Women, with advanced practices of investigation and prosecution, bringing together law enforcement, advocates, prosecutors, and forensic health professionals. In 2009, Ms. Langbein concluded a presidential appointment as Senior Policy Advisor to the Director of the United States Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. As Senior Policy Advisor, Ms. Langbein served as Chief Strategist on the Office on Violence Against Women. And on behalf of the Director, she guided and evaluated program and administrative processes and worked to implement standards and protocols for internal and external operations. She supported the ongoing efforts within the Office of Violence Against Women for policy issues regarding the implementation of the Violence Against Women's Act. It is great to have you here. Go ahead, Jan.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And I want to especially thank the League of Women Voters and these other esteemed panelists. I learn from you every time. I've just taken copious notes, so thank you for including me in on this panel. Sheriff Gonzalez spoke about a homicide in Houston. I would imagine by now you have heard about the homicides in Austin that happened a little over a week ago, perpetrated by a former sheriff's detective. He went on Sunday morning. He went to the supervised exchange location in the Arboretum there in Northwest Austin, and he shot his ex-wife, killed her, killed his stepdaughter, and killed the stepdaughter's boyfriend as well. The only person not murdered was his biological son, who ran from the location. Last year, he was arrested on charges of sexually assaulting that stepdaughter. A protective order was issued. He was required to surrender firearms and should never have had access to a gun. I want to share with you that for the past 3 legislative sessions, many of us have worked on efforts to address the enforcement, not gun removal, but the enforcement of state and federal laws that say it's unlawful for someone that is subject to a protective order or convicted of domestic violence crimes to possess firearms. And these laws have been on the books for over 20 years, but most jurisdictions have not figured out a system for those firearms submissions. Currently, Senate Bill 1967, which was authorized by Senator Royce West, is being considered. It would create, if it gets into committee and on pass, it would create an advisory committee that could help jurisdictions across the state of Texas creating policies and procedures to help make those communities safer. And so these laws that we're talking about, they're not intended, the state and federal laws, they're not intended to restrict gun owners unless they perpetrate domestic violence. They're not intended to take away constitutional rights unless they are perpetrators of domestic violence. These laws are on the books because the statistics are shocking. You all have heard statistics this morning. Almost every week in our state, someone affected by domestic violence is murdered with a firearm. Now, that is most often the victim. It can be a bystander that's in the home, or it can be in Sutherland, Texas at the First Baptist Church. It can be a police officer answering that emergency call. In fact, more police officers are killed answering domestic violence calls than any other kind of call. I chair the Fatality Review Committee for the Dallas County, and we intimate partner Fatality Review, and we find, just like in other communities across Texas and across the country, approximately 60 to 65% of those intimate partner homicides, those victims are killed with a firearm. Studies tell us that even the mere presence of a firearm in the home where there is domestic violence increases lethality by 500%. We have heard comments about House Bill 1927, that it will allow people to protect themselves. But how does a victim of domestic violence how do victims protect themselves from the monsters who live with them behind closed doors? We will never, ever have safe streets if we do not have safe homes. House Bill 1927 does say that for when there would be exemptions in that would agree with state and federal laws. It would restrict it. But so the subject of a protective order or convicted. But let me tell you, the majority of perpetrators of domestic violence are not reported. They're not reported and they're not arrested. They're not arrested and they're not convicted. And in fact, the consequences are so low that it's almost a green light to go forth and abuse some more. To make guns more accessible, particularly to criminals, whether they've ever been arrested, they've ever been convicted, or ever had a protective order. These criminals, to make that guns more accessible to them, more women will die. More moms and more sisters and more stepdaughters and more grandchildren, more coworkers, more women will die. You've heard that almost from all of us today. And if we truly want to make our communities safer, we cannot start by arming more people. It just doesn't make any sense. And with so few weeks left in the legislative session, is it appropriate to almost slip this legislation through and even creating a new committee to hear it? That House Bill 1967 actually is heard, or hopefully will be heard, in state affairs, but that's usually where bills that we are interested in go to die. I mean, that's where pornography is heard and other gun laws and so on and so forth. So I'm holding my breath on that one. But if in fact this does move forward, I would request that if there could be at least some considerations of edits. Now, I have heard that no one is interested in editing any of the wording, but the presence of a domestic violence abuser with a gun in a domestic violence shelter, if he walks into Hawk in Houston, he's not there because he has a constitutional right to carry a gun. He's there to kill somebody or everybody. I would hope that there would be considerations that firearms would be restricted from domestic violence shelters and domestic violence programs, from court-ordered visitation sites, just like the Austin shooting issue, the Austin shooting last week, and also court-ordered batterers intervention programs. And I don't think there should be a cap on a fine. If somebody comes in, I ask them to leave and they don't want to leave, and I call the police. By then, I got news, it's too late. Too late. You think of that you think of that Sutherland Springs shooting, and there weren't minutes, there weren't seconds before people died, and that guy should have never had a firearm. You know, Dr. Dark just mentioned that the NRA said that we don't have a right to speak on this. I absolutely think it's our job. It is our right as voters, our right as human beings. And I would just ask you, if not us, then who should speak about this? And if not now, then when? We need to let our voices and our votes be heard. I want to thank you for having me here today. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Amy Turney is going to lead the questions and answers. Amy? Yep. I can't hear Amy, so if she comes back on. Amy, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I do have a bit of a poor connection, so I may
All right.
need you to pinch for me. As I'm looking at the participant list, and if anyone would like to answer or to ask a question, if you'd use the feature to raise your hand, we'll call on you and we will unmute you. And I do see that we have representatives from the media in attendance right now. We also have the ability, if you'd rather not speak, we have a Q&A feature where you can write your questions and the panelists can answer those questions as well. And that's interesting. We're also recording this, and we will post this recording, I believe, on our YouTube channel. And we will, this will also be placed on my page for the League of Women Voters of Texas. Megan with Hayes Free Press in Kyle, Texas. Since there is a scheduled hearing for Thursday, what are your thoughts on the timeline and process for this bill? Well, this is, the Senate can set their own rules, basically. They usually, what will happen is if they do vote on the bill after hearing testimony, and they can do that immediately, and that happens within the House as well, then the bill can be placed on the calendar of intent, and then the bill could be heard at any time on the floor of the Senate. If there are no amendments to the bill, then the bill would go on to the governor. If there are amendments to the bill, then the bill would go back to the House. The author of the bill would have to say whether they accept the amendments or not. If they do not accept the amendments, then a committee will be created from both Senate members and House members to come up with an agreeable substitute. And then that will be voted on again in the House and the Senate. I saw House Bill 1177 was a perfect example of this, that went all the way through what's called a conference committee. And that was in the last legislative session in 2019, where there was a committee substitute that was offered in the Senate. The author did not agree with the committee substitute. A conference committee was formed. There were some very questionable things that happened in the conference committee before they agreed upon it. And the bill was the very last piece of legislation to be passed in the last session. Sheriff Gonzalez is saying that he has to sign off and is thanking us for the opportunity. And thank you, Sheriff Gonzalez. From Kennedy Sessions with the Texas Signal, what do y'all say to lawmakers that say Texas has a mental health problem and not a gun problem? And Matthew, I think you would be best to speak to that, but any of you who would like to speak to that, we'd be happy to hear from you.
Well, I'm dying to jump in. It's hard for me to be on a panel when it comes to answering questions. I just want you to know this is not about mental health when it comes to femicide or killing a spouse or partner. It is a choice. Family violence is not about mental health. It's not an illness. It's a choice. And so to say that, you know, if we could just clean up the mental health problem, there wouldn't be any shootings in the home, that is just absolutely not educated. It is not an understanding of life. I don't know. But it's not a clear understanding of the problem.
Thank you.
I'd like to answer a little bit about this too. Yes, there are mental health problems in this country, and we definitely don't have the mental health infrastructure that we really need. You know, working where I work, we see a lot of mental health issues. And surprisingly enough, folks that have mental health issues, other than suicide, are not necessarily likely to be more violent than anyone else. As I think Jan was kind of alluding to, the people that think of violence towards others are a different type of thing going on. But, you know, I think we need to step back from this as, you know, let us not blame the individual, let us not blame the gun itself. I look at this kind of like another disease, right? Violence is a disease, okay, whether that violence is self-directed or directed at other people. And the trick is, how do you treat that disease? Now, sometimes it's through, you know, means restriction, you know, for suicide. So, you know, firearms are the most deadly way of killing people. And if you can restrict the means, then you can prevent them from harming themselves permanently. So that's one thing that you can do. But at the same time, if you look at this sort of in the public health vein, when you're looking at firearms, think of firearms like mosquitoes, okay? The true disease is something like Zika or malaria or whatever. That's the violence. And then it's the mosquito or the firearm that transmits that violence from one person to the next person. So it's not only that we attack the disease itself, which is a good thing, but we do also need to look at the vector for that disease transmission. And that means looking at firearms, but not only just guns, looking at how people access them, looking at ways in which people, if they are impacted by firearms, can be saved. This is where the trauma system comes into play. And there's a lot of other things. And lastly, even if after I save somebody's life, what do we do with them afterwards, so that instead of continuing the cycle of violence and seeking retribution, they can find a positive outcome for themselves and break that chain.
Hi, everyone. Hey, Amy, I would like to say something as well. And I largely concur with what has already been said. And in the interim, this past interim, the House did convene a select committee on mass violence and prevention and community safety. And NAMI Texas did submit a number of comments, and this issue was studied specifically. And some really important statistics or information to keep in mind is that only roughly 4% of violence, it can be directly attributed to individuals' mental health. There are a number of other variables that contribute to a risk for perpetrating violence. 41% of violence events, the individual did have somebody in mind prior to the event. 42% of those individuals or instances, the individual harbored grievances related to their work, school, financial or interpersonal relationships. And 78% of perpetrators exhibited behaviors that elicited concern from others prior to the attack, which would indicate that thinking more broadly, instead of just focusing on mental health, just the entire ecosystem of our culture and our society may be a better way to address violence, or mass violence specifically, in helping individuals to identify circumstances for individuals when they are under distress or in distress that may contribute to or lead to instances of violence. So that in our view would mean that we need more mental health services available. Obviously some common sense gun laws in place as well, but making sure that individuals are able to access the care that they need prior to the point where they get to a situation where they may be more likely to perpetrate violence on someone.
Thank you, Matthew. We have another question. And for those of you who are attending, perhaps you are raising your hand. I'm using an iPad though, and when I check the participant list, I'm not able to see it. So I'm reading off the questions that are coming in through the Q&A. Megan again with Free Press in Kyle, Texas. As some of you mentioned before, many are against this bill for various reasons, but have you seen any data or statistics who are in favor of this bill? Jill, that might be a good question. Since you talked about the data earlier, the poll that came out earlier.
Sure, there's a poll that I mentioned on March 2021, so March last month, from UT Tyler and Dallas Morning News that said the majority of Texans do not want to change our license to carry system. And every single category, it's more than a majority of folks. Republicans, men, women, gun owners, Democrats, independents. A majority of Texans in all of those categories do not want to change our license to carry proposal. And frankly, I'm not trying to be sarcastic about this, but it seems like folks in support are certain legislators that might have a different agenda than safety. People who cannot right now qualify for a license to carry would benefit from this policy. And so I think that legitimately the majority of Texans, well, it's shown that the majority of Texans do not want to change our license to carry system. And that why would we govern to support gun extremists or persons who wouldn't qualify for a background check, can't shoot accurately. So this is a policy that we need to look at closely and say it's not safe and not supported.
Excuse me, Jill, who authored 1927?
Representative Matt Schaefer.
Oh, that's right. And what about the Senate 2224?
Senator Schwertner filed that last week.
Okay.
And speaking to someone who may not be able to qualify, I have been under doctor's care for corneas, for scars on. And so as I'm looking at my screen, and this is one of the reasons I had to take my glasses off to be able to navigate here, it's like looking at you through a dirty windshield. And there are days where I have very, very poor vision. And this has been going on for over a year. And if you think about it, my mother, who has macular degeneration and has glaucoma and can no longer drive, she could legally carry a handgun. And she has a 50-inch television and watches Westerns all the time because she can at least see the horses because she can't see people very well on them. We have another question from the audience. What is the best way to apply pressure against this bill? Should we call the committee or the governor? Yes to both, and also the lieutenant governor and your own senator. Your senator needs to know sooner rather than later. As someone who has worked in the Texas legislature, as the correspondence and the calls are coming in, there's a database where that information can be entered. And so the sooner that you contact, then the sooner it gets answered, and as it not answered, but entered. And then in addition to that, the things will bog down as there are mass volumes of people calling. So you definitely want to do it before it makes it to the floor. Does anybody else have any other thoughts? And we have another question from Kennedy Sessions. Why are legislators creating bills that are against the interest of the majority of Texans?
Always a good question, and people ask me those types of questions all the time. I would say some folks have a different agenda than keeping Texans safe. That there are primary voters that are influencing policy, I believe. And I think that there's a lack of understanding and a lack of knowing the data and the facts. That's why, often reporters, others will ask me for someone, quote, on the other side. And my opinion is the two sides are facts and not facts. And so if you have the facts about who the majority of Texans support, it has caused a double-digit increase in other states where they have weakened their gun laws. And that it's just common sense when you look at the requirements for license to carry and the number of rejections that have been done. If you look at the facts, you have to oppose permitless carry.
I was asked to repeat the question. Why are legislators creating bills that are against the interest of the majority of Texans? Is there anyone else that would like to chime in? Okay, I have another question, and that is from Megan Waring. Can you explain Senate Bill 2224 in relation to House Bill 1927?
So I guess I'm the legislative nerd, although Grace is pretty nerdy too. I have documents that I have done that talk about 1927 and 2224 and their differences and similarities. What it comes down to, though, however, is permitless carry. That's, as I was angsting over it, that's the main thing that you need to be the takeaway from each of those. House Bill 1927, it's shockingly bad in that it not only has permitless carry, but it would change a lot of existing law and loosen and lower penalties for irresponsible gun behavior. Senate Bill 2224 has some bad things as well. So it's important to realize that I think it's two other permitless carry bills were voted out of the House committee, House Homeland and Public Safety Committee, sorry. And those are both in the wings. So I try not to talk too much about the different bill numbers because poof, a committee was created last week and a bill was filed. So the point is, when it's permitless carry to bring a handgun in public, we need to oppose it. One of the really dangerous things in House Bill 1927 is what I call the oops provision. we have a provision like this, but this broadens it to say that a person who irresponsibly and illegally carries a handgun where that person should not, because signs are posted or it's a prohibited place for firearms. If they are approached by the manager, owner, someone in charge and told to leave, then if they leave subsequently, that's a defense to prosecution. So I would like to hear, and I don't have it in front of me, but the woman from the Houston Hawk, if she could respond how that feels about entering shelters and programs related to domestic violence and having to confront an armed, irresponsible individual with a gun.
Well, I think Jan said it best, at the point by which you're doing that, it's probably already too late. But even if it weren't, what we know is that abusers, they specialize in tactics of coercion and intimidation. So the idea that, showing up with a gun is a tactic to intimidate and threaten, even if there isn't at that moment intent to use the firearm. It definitely is a way to send a signal to the survivor or to our agency that you aren't safe and you don't have a right to be safe. And of course, as we all know, things can escalate very quickly. The OOPS provision is obviously of great concern. OOPS doesn't, you don't get to claim OOPS if you show up at a DV shelter with a gun. So thank you for asking.
We have another question.
Amy,
how do
can
you-
I ask a question?
Certainly.
And probably a little bit about this OOPS provision. Just a couple times the past couple weeks, we've had people in our hospital with guns. One, I think, was a patient that I believe was awaiting psychiatric evaluation. Another one was the gentleman that I spoke about before when we were looking for his wallet. One of my residents found his firearm in his pocket. So oops there. My question is about the bill. I wasn't able to track it fully myself, but I had read through some of the legislative text before it was voted on, and I saw something in there saying that the penalty was removed if you happen to be intoxicated while carrying your firearm. Is that something that made it through and the legislature actually passed that?
They did not. Representative Rosenthal's bill, to my knowledge, is still in committee. And we testified against that, and not against it, we testified for it. This is why I'm not a panelist. I always say the opposite of what I mean. But we testified for the bill, and that's actually the testimony that has the most significant amount of documented research in it. The statistics for firearm injuries and homicides tied to alcohol and drug use are just absolutely staggering. And so in Texas right now, if you have a gun while you are intoxicated in public on your own property, that's different. But if you're in public, there's no penalty for that. And all Senator Rosenthal's bill is trying to do is make that a Class C misdemeanor. And to my knowledge, it's still in committee.
If I can just, so Dr. Dark is just like me saying, when you get the bills all side by side, and it's, so Representative Rosenthal had a bill last session and this session that would make it illegal to carry a gun while you're intoxicated. Apparently Senate Bill 2224 included a couple of fairly decent things that do not make permitless carry go away. But as far as I read it, Senate Bill 2224 would absorb the language of Representative Rosenthal's bill and make it illegal to carry a gun when you're intoxicated. But we have to focus on the big picture that permitless carry is the poison pill and we just can't have it.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. How do you see the intersections between permitless carry and how it affects communities of color in the state of Texas?
Well, I'll take a crack at this one too, because I think when you think about gun deaths and gun violence in America, you can kind of dichotomize it into two big groups. There's suicides, which counts for about 2/3, and then there's like homicides, which are about 1/3, and then sprinkled in there you have your mass shootings, your unintentional injuries, and all that. But the two big ones are suicide and homicide. Suicide tends to be something where demographically you probably are going to find that in white male communities, whereas homicides tends to be more of a black male issue. And so when you're talking about communities of color and we're talking about, you know, violence and how that takes place, allowing people to walk around communities without permits is, in my opinion, just going to exacerbate that issue. You know, people that are committing crime, a large portion of the time, they're not going through the permitting background check process. As we all know, like 1 out of 5 guns sold in the US are done without the background check process. Even if people went through background checks, if you extrapolate how many people fail their background checks to now, there's probably 750,000 firearms that are out on the streets that shouldn't be in the hands of the people whose hands they're in, because we have this big loophole. And so that's where I see that the problem is going to be, is that it's going to make firearms in the hands of people that shouldn't have them a little bit more prevalent. And now not only will they be in those hands, they'll be legally paraded around in a concealed manner, which makes it even harder to get them off the streets. Harold Pollack, who's a researcher up at University of Chicago, has a line that I like to say, like, every illegal gun starts out as a legal gun. And the main thing we have to do is figure out how to stop that transition from legal firearms to illegal firearms. Permitless carry, lack of background checks, that does not help that situation at all.
Thank you.
Amy, it is almost 1 o'clock. You want to wrap up?
Yes, if I could have one more question answered. It is, what can women who are in domestic violence situations do to protect themselves? And this is from Kennedy Sessions with Texas Signal.
I think Jan should take that.
I'll do it, but we may run over a minute. I heard a physician say the other day with regards to COVID that if someone has COVID, they're really not responsible for curing COVID. You can literally give a patient more Kleenex and it'll mop it up, but it isn't going to cure the disease itself. So if we think in terms of what can women do to protect themselves, certainly there are shelters, certainly there are good relationships with law enforcement and with neighbors and friends, but listen to these headlines. John hit Mary because dinner was late. The next day it is Mary was hit because dinner was late. The next day is Mary was hit. And the next day was Mary is a battered woman. I don't know where John is. We barely mentioned him on the first day. I think until we have a societal paradigm shift that removes the onus of domestic violence against women off the victim and onto the perpetrator, we're going to continue to build more shelter beds and continue to have more shootings in church and on and on. I certainly do not think that arming more abusers is the answer for sure. There are things in place to help women. Often they do not access those. In fact, I mentioned I'm on the Fatality Review Committee, and as we review every single domestic homicide in our county, we found, and we go around the room with law enforcement, prosecutors, CPS, schools, shelter providers, all of the women that we come across never reached out for any help whatsoever. And so the good news is those that do don't die, but the bad news is we've got to get the word out on the resources, but more so we've got to figure out a way to hold perpetrators accountable. We've done it with smoking. We don't let friends drive drunk anymore. When are we going to stand up on this issue and get the get the, like I say, the onus off the victim. Only domestic violence and sexual assault is the victim held accountable. Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you get away? What did you say? Why do you dress that way? On and on. So anyway, that's my opinion, is hold accountable those who perpetrate the crime.
Thank you.
I would just add to that, the accountable, the people who perpetrate the crime, but also the systems that create the kinds of vulnerabilities. So for example, when women make so much less on the dollar and women of color make even less, it's very hard for them to achieve the kind of financial independence that allows them to sustain themselves independent of their abusers. So it's the perpetrators, but it's also the systems that are marginalizing people and making people vulnerable to abuse and violence. As long as there are people who are systematically marginalized and disadvantaged, they're going to be vulnerable to violence. And we've got to deal with that as well as the offender accountability.
Thank you very much. So we'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. And again, we are recording this and this will be posted on our YouTube channel and also on the gun safety issue page of the League of Women Voters of Texas. I'd like to remind everyone that gun safety is not a partisan issue. And if you, I think it may be important if you see that your legislator is voting for the bill and you are of the same party, to let them know that you're a member of that party when you're calling. Grace, did you have any other words?
No, thank you all for being here. I appreciate all the panelists and all the folks here, the media who listened in and hopefully learned something, and we'll share that information out to the wider Texas audience. I think that they need this information. I think it's really important. Don't wait. Now is the time to talk to your legislator. Our website is lwvtexas.org, and I know that Texas Gun Sense, they have a website too, right? Right, Jill? What is your Texas Gun Sense website?
txgunsense.org. So txgunsense.org. And you can sign up, and we're issuing calls to action about permitless carry and other bills.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And we are too. Okay, so thank you so much for being here, and vote in every election. Thank you.